Awesome, students. I hope you're doing great today. In this edition of our remote learning, I'm going to go over the concept of motifs with you. Now, this should be just review for you. If you recall, we went over motifs with our short stories and with the novella, The Metamorphosis. So we're going to take this concept that you already know about and we're going to apply it to Macbeth here. Now, if you remember what the instructions tell you to do for that one-page writing that you're doing for me is that you're going to talk about how the motif of the supernatural drives forward the concept, one of the thematic concepts or multiple thematic concepts within Macbeth. You still have a little bit of leeway here. But first, what I'm going to do before I get into Macbeth, and we're only going to touch on it, just a few quotes, pieces of textual evidence from Act 1 in Macbeth, just to sort of give you an idea and to make you feel comfortable at it. I'm going to leave you to do the rest of it. But what we're going to do first is I'm going to give you the definition once again with motif. Then I'll give you a few other types of examples, real world examples, if you will, as well as some examples from the literature that we've already read. So let me bring them up. Let me share the screen with you, ladies and gentlemen. My awesome PowerPoint here, motif. So the definition says that in a literary piece, a motif is a recurrent image, an idea, or an action that develops or explains a theme. So it can be those things there. Now, some people also say symbols and and that's all very true, but it's the same concept. So an imagery, idea, or action. And by image, we don't just literally mean like a physical item that you describe. We could just be talking about colors. That could be an image, right? Or music, things on that nature, meaning sound that characters might hear. That is all part of imagery. It's not just what one sees. So let's take a look here at some real world examples, if you will. So when we go into our school, which we haven't been in, unfortunately, since about March 13th, we see this image or something very similar to it repeated throughout the school. It's not just at the front doors. It's not just in the office. We see it on the floors. We see it on the walls. We see it in classrooms. So it's repeating. It's throughout the whole thing, all right? And it's not necessarily this exact image, but it's the colors of the school, right? It's the mascot. Sometimes he looks like this, and sometimes he's like that sort of muscular, athletic looking Dickinson. Or if you're in robotics with Mr. Bowser, you see sort of a different version of it. The sweatshirt that sometimes I wear has that Dickinson logo on there too. So the point is, it repeats again and again and again. So we've established that this, or something very close to it, is a motif. So what's the thematic concept then that it supports or drives forward? Well, think like school pride. I mean, that is sort of the thematic concept, that this image, as well as all the colors and the mascot associated with it, drives forward as it relates to Dickinson itself. So what's another example? Let's sort of tighten it in. Think about my classroom. On all the walls, you see all those pennants, right? The college pennants. That's obviously motif too. It's a repeating image. In this case, it's very specific, the different types of pennants that you see there. And it's driving forward, of course, the importance of education. It's driving forward the thematic concept of college and everything that is associated with it. Or more broadly, because I don't just have university pennants, I have technical schools, the idea of getting a higher education, of doing something educationally speaking beyond just high school. So this is another example of a motif and how it drives the theme. So what about in literature? Think about the lottery. If you recall, the lottery is the one where the woman's stoned to death at the end after they draw the slips of paper. One of them has the black dot on it. One of the motifs, I mean, there's multiple motifs, like the slips of papers are motifs, but one of the motifs, of course, are the stones. You see the stones in the beginning. You see the stones kind of in the middle, like in the early portion of when they're drawing the slips of paper, and then you definitely see them at the end. Now, the stones themselves are symbols. We know that. We discussed that. But the repeating image that we see throughout the text, and what is the thematic idea that the stones sort of push forward? Well, in this particular case, the stones are pushing forward that concept of violence, right? The concept of like what humanity is. And it's not saying good stuff. Well, isn't that the same thing as what the symbol's saying? Yeah, so remember, symbols can support or be motifs too. Last but not least, we think about the metamorphosis. And obviously it wasn't a baby in Metamorphosis, but you had that giant cockroach instead. But the motif we're talking about is eating. So remember, it's not just something that you see, right? Let's take a look at the definition once again. It's not just an image, it's not just an idea, but can also be an action. In this case here with the metamorphosis, it's both an action and an idea. It's more of an idea when you have Gregor and he's thinking about eating, he wants to have breakfast, he wants to take his time having breakfast. That's more of an idea. Later on, when the food is put in front of him and how he eats, the type of food, remember sometimes it's milk and bread and other times it's rotten food, or we think about the people who are staying overnight, the leasers, I forget their exact title, and the big to-do that's done with the food that's put before them, or we think about the father and how he takes a long time eating his breakfast. All those actions, all those ideas, they're related to the broader thematic concept within the metamorphosis. So what's the thematic concept then? There's a lot of things we can talk about in humanity that Gregor sort of is perceived as, how society treats him. We can talk characterization-wise about how he sort of is degrading more and more and more, reflected within the food itself. So lots of things we can talk about. So again, when we think about motif, it's this repeating image, it's a repeating idea, it's a repeating action, and hopefully you have a better understanding of it based on just those examples. So now let's open up Macbeth. And again, we're only going to stick to Act 1. We're going to look at really just one scene, scene 3. So let me share that text with you. And hopefully it's large enough for you to see it. Some of you asked me to make the text a little larger, and hopefully this is helpful to you. So we're going to take a look at the second appearance of the witches. So actually, let me just back up for just 1 second. So remember, the motif we're interested in is the supernatural. And it can be an image, right? It can be an action, it can be an idea, it can be a variety of things. So I think we agree that the witches are an example of the supernatural. So we have the second occurrence of the witches. The first one was in scene 1, where they sort of are sitting together and say they're going to see Macbeth soon after the battle is won, right? And that's where they talk about fair and foul. In this particular case here, the first witch, she talks about how she's near this sailor's wife and she's eating chestnuts. Not she is, but the sailor's wife is eating chestnuts. And so the witch wants some chestnuts, and the sailor's wife says, "No, you're a witch, go away." So the witch is enraged here, right? And so what does she do? Well, when we take a look here in line, so we're again, Act 1. Here, let me bring up the note for you so you can better see it here. So we're talking about Act 1, Scene 3, lines about 18 to 25. So after the sailor's wife says no, the witch becomes very angry, and she casts a spell. And the spell, in essence, she talks about controlling the winds, that the sailor, meaning the husband of this woman, that the sailor needs while he's sailing. And she's going to make all the winds go against him. So she's going to be stuck out at sea for a long, long time, for about a year and a half. And then on top of that, she talks about how he's going to be staying awake. Now, whether he's staying awake because she's cast another spell on him, or he's staying awake because he's so stressed out and he's got to control the boat at all hours of the, at all hours of the day, we're not sure. But nonetheless, so this spell was cast on him, and in essence, he's going to die. So this is the supernatural, not just the witches, but the action itself, the spell. And in fact, every time the witches, and almost every time, maybe every time supernatural events take place, something evil happens, right? Something malevolent happens. So thematically speaking, that evil, that malevolence, either of the characters or of the witches or of just events themselves, that's a thematic idea that the supernatural motif is pushing forward. It's really basic and simple. Something a little bit more complex, of course, is when the witches have a conversation with Macbeth and Banquo, right? Now, the prophecy itself, so again, we're still in scene 3 of Act 1, and we're at about lines 48 through 50. The prophecy itself isn't necessarily driving forward the theme that I'm going to talk about, but it sort of sets the stage for it. And this is the idea of internal conflict, right? And to a lesser extent, maybe guilt. So she says, or they say rather, all hail Macbeth. They call him Thane of Glum, Thane of Cawdor, and of course, the king, he shall be the king hereafter. So this sets the stage of internal conflict, because now Macbeth is going to have to think again, do I kill Duncan or not, right? And so with these witches, with this reoccurring image and the recurring prophecy and the recurring supernatural concept or supernatural imagery here in events. It helps drive forward the thematic idea of internal conflict, or more specifically, guilt. What are some other examples of how the supernatural drives forward or supports or elevates the thematic concept of conflict and guilt? Well, think about the dagger, right? Think about the appearance of Banquo, reappearance after he's dead, so the ghost of Banquo. If you've gotten to Act 5 yet, Lady Macbeth does something very specific with her hands. She's trying to wash something off of it that does not appear. That's not literally there. That's a supernatural occurrence taking place. You can sit there and say, well, isn't that a hallucination? We're sort of grouping all that in the same thing. The dagger could be a hallucination or supernatural. Her washing her hands could be a supernatural thing or a hallucination, but we're sort of grouping it together. But all those events, all those images that I described to you, it supports and pushes forward the thematic concept of guilt or internal conflict. So we'll stop right there, ladies and gentlemen. As always, if you have any questions, send me an email. But just as a reminder, again, let me just touch on what the expectations are. So you'll write that one pager for me, and it's similar to the other ones that you've done. And you're going to be discussing not just the motif in general, you have to acknowledge it, but you're discussing how the motifs drive forward, how they push, how they support the thematic concept. Now you can, if you want to talk about one thematic concept, maybe you just want to talk about evil, or you can sort of almost catalog the different thematic concepts that the supernatural motif supports and drives forward. I hope you're doing great, and I look forward to reading these essays from you. Have a great day.